Welcome to the Internet Reviewed, where I'm taking a look at the online world, one content creator at a time, to help you know who's worth following and when to smash that mute button. Now, there's been quite a bit of chat lately about the problems with Joe Rogan's podcast, and today I have something for you that I think stands in very stark contrast in a good way to that show.
It sounds crazy, but I'm only talking to people that I'm interested in talking to. I mean, this is the marketplace of ideas in real time.
In case you've been living under a rock, Joe Rogan hosts pretty much the biggest podcast in the world, and he cops a lot of hate for his, shall we call it, naively curious approach to the people he interviews, many of whom go on his show and say some sort of wacky and sometimes simply untrue things, but get no real pushback from a curious but perhaps a little bit too credulous Joe. This is something he was recently called out for by the conservative commentator Douglas Murray, who was on his show as a guest. You might have seen this clip doing the rounds lately.
If you throw a lot of shit out there, there's some point at which I'm just raising questions is not a valid thing. Mm-hmm. You're not raising questions. You're not asking questions. You're telling people something.
So it's in that context that I'm bringing you what I think is the antidote to the just asking questions approach and is a real hidden gem. It's called the Joe Walker Podcast. It was formerly known as the Jolly Swagman Podcast, and it's been called the 4.5-hour podcast you're missing out on. And I really can't believe that it's not better known. Most people, once they stumble across it, realize how excellent it is, and I just think it deserves a much bigger audience.
The Joe Walker Podcast is so clearly one of the best podcasts in existence. It is stunning how frequently he is able to ask extremely interesting questions that the guests have obviously never heard or even contemplated before.
Now, on the surface, the similarities between this one and the Joe Rogan Experience are almost uncanny. This too is a long-form podcast hosted by a guy called Joe, and it's just him having conversations with really interesting people, from comedians to politicians to economists and scientists. He calls it a space for curious contrarians and says it's done in the spirit of following interesting ideas wherever they may lead.
My podcast is an extension of my curiosity. I choose a guest with important and, ideally, underrated ideas. I research as much as possible, and I ask the burning questions that excite me most. The result is less a performance and more a conversation between two friends, a chat which you get to eavesdrop on.
As it happens, a number of Joe Walker's podcast guests have also appeared on Joe Rogan's show. Both Joes have interviewed cognitive scientist Steven Pinker, the intellectual dark web brothers Brett and Eric Weinstein, astrophysicist Avi Loeb, and social psychologist Jonathan Haidt. But Joe Walker has also had a number of very impressive guests on his show who, for various reasons, I think it's unlikely would ever appear on Joe Rogan's podcast, despite his much, much bigger platform. Just to give you a few examples, Joe Walker has spoken to linguist Noam Chomsky, businessman Mark Cuban. He's had a number of Nobel Prize winners on, and last year he sat down with statistician and author Nassim Taleb.
It's an honor to have him on the podcast. Welcome, Nassim.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, Nassim Taleb doesn't grant all that many podcast interviews, so that was a pretty big get for Joe Walker.
Taleb doesn't do a lot of podcasts. This is a huge compliment to you.
I like how Taleb goes on small-time podcasts instead of big crappy ones like Lex Frodman.
So, what makes this Joe's long-form conversations with interesting people so different from that Joe's and everyone else out there trying to do the same thing? And what makes all these interesting people so willing to bother with his quote-unquote small-time podcast? The answer is in the description of his show.
Well-researched interviews with the world's deepest thinkers.
Joe Walker really does an extraordinary amount of research to prepare for his interviews, and it's evident not only to his listeners, but to his guests as well.
One of your listeners has come up with a drinking game that they posted on an Apple Podcast review, which is that every time one of your guests says something like, wow, that's a really good question, or that's a very interesting question, they have a drink. And it's no surprise that they get sloshed by the end of the interview. the Danny Kahneman interview at the very end, as it's kind of fading out, you hear him say, "Oh, you're a very good interviewer."
By the way, just out of curiosity, I went and checked, and you can indeed hear Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel Prize-winning psychologist who had undoubtedly sat for hundreds of interviews in his lifetime, complimenting Joe at the end of their interview. Here's the clip.
You're a very good interviewer.
There was also high praise for Joe's preparation from Dr. Ken Henry, the former Secretary of the Australian Treasury.
You are too well briefed. You are too well briefed.
Being that well briefed is what made that conversation 4.5 hours of talking to a former public servant about tax, as the Fin Review put it, so interesting to listen to. And the proof was in the pudding. It was the best rating episode for the podcast that year.
So this is a good question. All your questions have been good.
If you're interested in knowing just how Joe is constantly coming up with such good questions, I really recommend watching this video on his YouTube channel where he's interviewed about his interview research process.
You have an extremely unusual process for preparing for your podcast. In some way, you are a kind of athlete of learning along some really unusual axis. And because my research is all about learning, I am very curious about your process, and I want to ask you many, many questions.
Joe goes on in that chat to show the way he creates reading lists, takes notes, drafts questions, writes up memory prompts, flags important parts in books that he wants to return to. Like, the guy really does dive deep. And he explains that his process is, of course, somewhat dependent on the person he's talking to. But they go into quite a bit of detail talking about the interview he did with Nassim Taleb, the one I mentioned just earlier. And I really want to share a few of the insights that came out because it's a really good example to show the amount of work that Joe Walker puts in before talking to somebody.
I'm trying to furnish myself with context for the interview and the guest's body of work.
So Nassim Taleb is a statistician, a former option trader and a risk analyst. He's basically a super brainy numbers guy. He's also a bit of a jerk on Twitter, but we'll leave that aside for now. He's most famous for a book he wrote in 2007 called The Black Swan. This was a bestseller for a number of weeks. It argued that highly improbable and unpredictable events, things like 9/11, are the most important drivers of human history. And to have a really intelligent conversation with Nassim Taleb about his ideas, it's clear that you would need to get your head around quite a lot of mathematics. So Joe did that. He describes doing about 2 months of work in the lead up to this interview with Nassim Taleb. He hired a private tutor to help him work through 2 key textbooks on introductions to probability and statistics, while also revisiting foundational maths with a second tutor, his aunt, who was a high school maths teacher. And well, let's hear him talk about the rest of what he did.
I also did Nassim's 2-week Real World Risk Institute course. Mm-hmm. So that was, I think, like 5 hours every night for 2 weeks, 10 business days. So that had an enormous amount of, I guess, like background or lead up prep before what I would call the intensive prep process. So the intensive prep process...
That was not intense. I want to highlight, it's 50 hours of course, just for the last course, plus the tutoring, not intensive. So what's the intensive prep?
And the intensive part is 1 to 3 weeks before the interview, where, 8 to 14 hours a day, you're reading as much of their stuff or stuff that's relevant to them as possible.
Right.
Note-taking practice, spaced repetition memory prompts. So every morning I'm doing prompts on the previous day's material. And for Taleb, that intensive process would have been maybe 9 days of intensive work for Taleb. So that's every day.
So call it another 100 hours.
Another 100 hours.
And all of those hours certainly seem to pay off, especially for people who were familiar with Nassim Taleb and his ideas, because they really enjoyed that conversation.
This was a gem video. You extracted so much out of him. This video is a treat for an Inserto reader.
But look, I do have to acknowledge that conversations at this level of detail, especially on this kind of subject matter, are for a somewhat niche audience. And look, not everyone is going to appreciate every interview that Joe does.
You both look like really nice and well-read individuals. However, this is a very bad interview with a lot of jargon and word salads.
But this is why I say I think he's the antithesis of Joe Rogan, because while I don't know this for sure, I strongly doubt Joe Rogan is putting that level of prep into his chats. And when you hear the resulting conversations from someone who is, it just makes it really clear how valuable that is. So full credit to Joe for putting the work in. And I think it's also worth noting that even after putting all of that work in, Joe Walker still apparently feels like it isn't enough.
Because you get into such depth on these topics and you're talking with world experts, how often do you find yourself, if ever, feeling out of your depth or a little bit like an imposter even, like this just got very technical very quickly or something like that?
Like all the time. I'm acutely aware of the fact that even with the research and preparation I do, which to be clear, I'm never happy with. I never feel like I've done enough. But even with that, so maybe putting in like tens of hours of reading and research and talking to other experts, doing that as preparation for an episode, I've still barely scratched the surface of their field. And a lot of that knowledge is just like very flimsy.
There have been 168 episodes of this podcast so far, and across those episodes, there's been quite a range of guests and subject matter covered. You can see here from their topics list that economics, finance, and investing features quite heavily, as does politics, psychology, science, and tech. They have episodes relating to history and philosophy and international relations and personal development, and plenty of those interviews are accessible to people not familiar with the subject matter. I assure you they're not all jargon and word salad. Just to give you a couple of examples, he did an interview with Mark Cohodes, which is all about investing and short selling and finance, but I really don't think you need to be a finance type person to get something out of it, as Joe points out at the start.
Also, if you're a non-finance person, I encourage you to listen anyway, because firstly, Mark is incredibly entertaining. He's a great storyteller, but also, we do our best to define a lot of the preliminary concepts and make them understandable. For example, I think I actually asked Mark for his definition of shorting. So, yes, that does mean that I went to the house of one of the greatest short sellers in the world and asked him to define shorting. So, I feel like you're now somewhat obliged to listen through if you're a non-finance person.
For what it's worth, I'm a non-finance person. I listened through and I got a lot out of it. Another episode I would really like to recommend is the one he did with Katalin Kariko. She is the Hungarian-American biochemist who was one of the inventors of mRNA technology. And in fact, shortly after she did this interview with Joe, she was awarded the Nobel Prize for her work, which was key to the development of COVID vaccines.
You are looking for something, and that is so exciting. That this hunt, because you have a hunch.
It was such a fantastic chat. Joe seemed to know not only every detail of her life story and career, but he also clearly had a fairly good grasp of the science behind mRNA, which meant he could ask her detailed and interesting questions about her discoveries. Now, I want you to hear Joe Walker explain the motivation behind creating such a wide-ranging but in-deep podcast. But I need to give you a bit of background before playing this clip. So Joe actually started the podcast with a mate called Angus. As I said earlier, it was originally called the Jolly Swagman Podcast. Angus moved on in 2019, but here's what Joe had to say in 2018 about what they were trying to do.
I thought I'd just take a moment to talk about what it is that we're doing, what we're hoping to achieve with the podcast, because you may have noticed that we do jump around a lot in terms of the guests we have on and the topics we cover. And I think it's fair to say that both Angus and I are very intellectually curious young men. So I wanted to give a defense of generalism, of why you too should be a dilettante, a polymath, of how you can be a jack of all trades and a master of many.
He goes on to give a pretty compelling defense of generalism. It's actually well worth listening to, but he then continues.
Now, to circle this back to podcasting, what are we doing here at the Jolly Swagman Podcast? Well, there are many podcasts, and I listen to these podcasts and I enjoy them, but podcasts which focus on a particular topic area. So say, fitness. And if you have a podcast that's devoted to fitness and you try and put out a weekly show, after a few years, eventually you're going to be expanding the amount of noise that you're delivering to your audience. In contrast, what we're aiming to do here at Swagman Media HQ is go out and find the best people we can find in the fields that we're interested in and you're interested in, and sit them down for an in-depth conversation to bring you as much signal as possible in an area before we move on.
So that's what he's going for, and in my view, I think he's doing a pretty good job of it. I also want to note that while many of his topics and guests are relevant to an international audience, he also has done quite a bit on Australian policy, and I don't think there's all that much else out there doing as good a job as he is. Joe Walker has interviewed 2 former Australian Prime Ministers, Kevin Rudd and Malcolm Turnbull. He's spoken to a bunch of former and currently serving Australian politicians and bureaucrats, the likes of John Hewson, Andrew Leigh, Abel Rivsey, Ken Henry. He spoke to Lucy Turnbull about urbanism. And I'd like to especially single out the recent Policy Salon series that Joe Walker has done. This was 6 live podcast events that he hosted over the last few months. I think he may have just added a 7th. He described those salons as
intimate, high-quality gatherings where big ideas meet thoughtful people. Each session focuses on a pressing policy issue, from immigration and housing to inequality and defence, with a hand-picked guest. I thought carefully about the perfect guest for each topic, and I'm lucky that every person I invited said yes.
I've listened to 3 of the 6 of those so far, the ones on housing, immigration and defence, and I can highly recommend them to any Australians out there. I honestly felt like I learnt more about those issues just by listening to those conversations than I have in years of following the news, and especially in the context of our upcoming federal election. I reckon they're really good primers for those issues, which are, as always, very prominent in the political campaign. Okay, so overall, what's my view? Well, I think it's pretty clear. I'm a huge fan of this podcast and I really think you should give it a go. It gets big ticks in all of my criteria for being trustworthy, accountable, and offering value to the discourse. The only thing I'm not 100% clear on is in transparency, whether Joe has a political affiliation. Now, apparently he used to be a political speechwriter and has worked in federal parliament, and someone claiming to be him, who I'm pretty sure is him, did once post to Reddit saying that, yes, we're Labor leaning. But for what it's worth, having listened to a lot of these episodes now, I don't sense a political agenda. My gut feeling on this is that if there is a leaning towards Labor, that's just more reflected in the Australian political guests that he gets rather than in any bias in the way he conducts his interviews. But that said, I am more across the recent episodes than the older ones. So if you've been listening longer than I have and you think I've missed the mark on anything, please do let me know. But yeah, if you do want to listen to somebody called Joe having long form conversations with interesting people, make it this one, because he's just asking questions too, but he's asking really good questions. Okay, so I had to bring Kenny in for this one because it's in his contract to appear at least once in every episode. But look, that is all from me for now. Please let me know what you think in the comments and write to me with any requests or suggestions you may have for people you'd like to see me review next. My email address is theinternetreviewed@gmail.com. Can I hear you purr? You've got to purr into the microphone.